Hello friends, this is secretmelva.io and we're back with another Golang tutorial. And today we're going to be doing a very small tutorial which is about querying YouTube stats. So I recently started my YouTube channel, actually yesterday, and I have been looking at my YouTube channel in the web browser like a normal person, and I'm getting really tired of it, and I want it in my terminal. I want to be able to script it. I want to be able to put it as a widget on my desktop, something like that. And so what I want to do is we'll do a walkthrough tutorial out how we can use Golang to hit the YouTube servers and ask if to our subscriber stats and our view count of our videos and so on and so forth. And so this is going to be quite a thorough follow-along tutorial where we'll code together and we'll have a working program by the end. And if we start with looking at the API that we're going to be using, the API is called the YouTube Beta API, version 3, I think. And I'll put a link to this in the description below. But essentially what it is, it's this big API that lets you query a bunch of stuff about YouTube. And the only thing we're interested in is the channel. So since we want the subscriber count. So there's some documentation on how this API works. And the only thing you will need to get started is you'll need to create a API key. And so there's a guide on here on the YouTube page it would load where you can actually create an API key and get going with your own API call. So you have to create an API key and we're going to pass that into our program, and I'll show you how. So what we'll end up with is we'll be creating a program that queries that API endpoint, and I've queried the API endpoints in my browser here, and don't worry, I'll be deleting this API key as soon as this video goes live and then regenerating it. So yes, you can see my API key here, but it will be active by the time you watch this video. And so basically, if you look at what this API call returns, it returns some nice JSON that has some information about our channel, and it has our view count and our subscriber count and our video count. And that's really what we're interested in. So we're going to be querying this API call in Golang, and then we're going to be formatting the output so that we can use it for something useful. So follow me, follow along in this tutorial, and we'll get started. So we are starting entirely from scratch. So the first thing we're going to do is, let me make my terminal a bit bigger. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a directory. Let's call this YouTube counter, for example. Let's go in there, and then we're going to create a new Go project. And your module, the way we do that is we use the go mod init command, and I'm just going to call it YouTube counter, like so. And now what Go would have done is it would have created this new go mod file. So now we can open a directory in our editor and get going. And let me make the editor a bit bigger as well. I recently started recording in 4K, so I realized everything might get a little bit small for some people, so I'm going to try to make the editor as big as I can for you to follow along on this. So this is going to be a very simple file, so we're just going to start with creating a single Go file. We'll put it in the main package. That's the only package we're going to have. We're just going to have a single file. It's via script. And again, what we want to do is we want to query this HTTP endpoint with our API key and a channel that we're targeting, and then we want to do something with the result, and that do something with the result is probably going to be printing it out for now, or maybe formatting it a little bit to make it nice, and then we might do something with it in the future. And so the first thing we sort of need is we need a way of getting our API key and the channel we're targeting into our program. And so we're going to create our main function, and then we're going to use a way to pass some flags or some parameters into our program for when we actually run it. And the way we do that in Go is that we use the flagged module. So we import flag, and we can actually create two flags that we need. So let's call one channel handle, and let's call one API key. So those are the two parameters that we need for our program. And then we can go ahead and we can say these identity strings. So we can use the string bar function from the flag module, and we can say, put this into channel handle, and we'll call it channel handle here as well. And then we'll say the default value is when you blank, and we'll say the YouTube channel handle to query. All right, so this is our first parameter. And the second one That's going to be similar, but it's going to be our API key. Then say API key, and we're going to say the YouTube data API be free key to use, right? And then what you need to do is you need to call flag.parse. So flag.parse, it says my documentation as well, parses the command line flags must be called after all flags are defined. So basically we define our flags and we called flag.parse. Right? And then what we can already do is we can import FTT and we can try printing out our channel handle in our API key. And now if we try to build our project, it's the go build counter.go. If we run counter.go, oops. If we run counter.go, it doesn't do anything because they're blank at the moment, right? So, but what we can do, sorry to illustrate, is we can actually, as to the value, we can say test, for example, it will print out test. And likewise for channel handle, well, we can say test handle, and it'll print out test handle and test. So that does work, right? So we saw the first scenario there where we actually didn't pass it anything. That's not good. So let's handle that error case well. It's version on memory. So let's say the API key is no, or if the channel handle is no, then we are going to print invalid API key or channel handle provided, and I'll just say aborted, right? And then we're going to say os.exit blunt, which means there was an error. And actually, this is a good point. So strings in Golang by default can't be null. So we'll just check for the empty string instead, right? So far so good. So now we have our API key and our channel handle. So the next thing we can do is we're actually ready to start preparing our HTTP request. And the way we do that is the Golang has a neat package called HTTP that has everything we need built in, though you need to pass it a URL. And if we go back to a browser, this might be small for you to see, we can actually copy the URL. This is from the API and use that as a template. So let's go ahead and define a URL template string. So 10-foot string. And then we're going to paste in that whole URL. And we're going to replace the API with a %s and the handle little %s too. So what we're doing here is we are essentially creating a template, and this %s is a conventional wildcard parameter that we can use to substitute strings in further down the line. So we're basically saying, yeah, this is the base template for our API call. And what we'll do then is we'll substitute the channel handle and the API key in from the things that we've passed into our program. So we can actually go ahead and do that straight away. So let's create the final URL. So we'll say URL, and we'll use the FNT sprintf function with our template and our channel handle and our API key. Alright, now let's try that out. Let's go ahead and print out our final URL, make sure it works. So we'll say go build counter.go, and then we'll run this, and you can see that it correctly created a URL here with our for handle and our key. Right. So far so good. Now we don't just want to print out URL. We actually want to send an HTTP GET request to this URL. And the great thing is that in Go that's really easy. What we can do is we can use the HTTP package that I already talked about and call HTTP GET, and then we can just cast a URL, and that's all we need to do. So this will fire off a HTTP GET request to this URL and try to return a result if there is one. So let's check if it succeeded. So the error is not sorted. There is not no something went wrong. So we'll print out an error. So let's say failed to get YouTube channel statistics, and then we can pass it in the actual error object, and then again we'll call osExit.1, which means we exit our program and say it didn't succeed, something was wrong. But more interestingly, if we do get something back, if the response isn't nil, let's do something with that. So this response is an interesting object. It has quite, as you can see, it has quite a lot of fields in Golang on this response that comes back. But the one we're interested in is the body. And if you look at the body type here, it says it's of type io.readCloser. So io.readCloser is an interesting type, but basically what we can do is we can use an IO reader to get something out of the body. So there is a convention which you do first, however, which is that since it's an IO reader, that's defer closing the reader. So we'll defer body look close, like so. And what this will do is that it will close the reader, make sure we don't leak any memory. And now we can try to say body or error is the result of IO, the real of the response.body. So essentially what we're saying here is the response came back, there was no error, we had a response, and we might have a body on there, we have a stream IO reader of the body. Let's try reading it and see if something comes out of that. So now it got that, so what we can then do is we can try printing it out. So we can print the length for body, and we can even try casting body to a string and see what happens. Let's try that. So we'll build it again, then we'll run it, and here we go. Couple of things. First of all, invalid arguments, and the API is not valid. So we are getting a response back. Right, this looks like a proper response, but it's correctly saying what you've passed me is complete nonsense because we passed it a test and a test handle, right? So let's try passing it the proper values. Let's do that. So we'll call it again, but this time we'll pass my YouTube handle, which is elder-io. And then we'll pass it my temporary API key, which again will be inactive by the time this video goes live. So we'll pass in our API key here, and then we'll try it again, and there you go. Now suddenly we're getting back a proper result. We're getting some metadata, we're getting a collection of items, and the item is the one channel that we're interested in, and we had a view count, and bear in mind I started my YouTube channel yesterday, so it's pretty low view count of 162, subscriber count of 16, and a view count of 2. So in theory we could stop here, right? We have a working program now, we can run this again and again. We could try running it with some other channels if we wanted to. We can try one, I don't actually know one by heart. There we go, Cutie Pie has a few more subscribers than I do so far. You never know what will happen in the future. But the thing is, this is still just a string representation. We're just casting it to a string, so we can't really do much of this. We can print it out, but we can't really interact with it. So the next thing I'd like to do is I'd like to marshal this string into a proper Golang struct so that we can work with it as a normal Golang struct. And since this representation is JSON, we're going to use the JSON library to actually do the marshalling. So we're going to say, interpret this as JSON, and then marshal it into a Golang struct, and then we can work with it as a normal Golang struct. So what do we need to do to make that happen? First things first, we need to actually create the struct, and the struct needs to resemble the format of the JSON that we're trying to marshal it from. So what I attempt to do, the easiest thing to do, is I tend to copy the JSON into my editor, right, like so, and then let's comment it out so that our editor doesn't lose its mind. And then I basically just manually go through and create the different things, and I usually go inside out. So I start with the lowest nested one. So if we start down here, right, this is the lowest nested one. Let's create some statistics, and I'm going to use mostly the same names, except for the actual struct names. It doesn't really matter. And I'm going to use uppercase or capitalized words, and the reason for that is the way the JSON library works in Golang, where it actually distinguishes between uppercase and lowercase when it comes to visibility of the item, and so we want them to be uppercase so that we can see them in our marshaled item. And then I'm just following for the data types. I'm just following the data types that are in the JSON. You can see, even though these are numbers, they're actually in quotes, so they're going to be treated as strings, which is why I've created them as strings down here. And then I realize this is a bit tedious, but I'll quickly do the same for the other parts. So we'll say total results. We'll say results per page. And again, we're going to capitalize this. And then we're going to have a channel statistics. Item. Just another's dropped. Like so. And that has a kind. And it has an E tag. And it has an ID. And finally, it has some statistics, which are of type channel statistic, right? Because this is B struct that we created up there. So again, I'm just going through these, going inside out and just going through them and creating this structure. So I need one more, right? Which is the outermost one, and we'll just call that channel statistics API response. This is the actual full response, right? So that has a kind, and it has a he tag, and it has a page info, which is going to be of type page info. We created the struct there. And then it has, if you look up here, it has a list of items, even though we're only going to have one item, but it doesn't know that at this stage. So we're just going to say, sure, it can be a list, but it's going to be a list of channel statistic item, right? So this is our struct, and we can clean it up a bit by getting rid of this now. This is the full struct in our program. And so the final thing we need to do now is we need to basically marshal this JSON into parse struct so that we can work with it as a normal Golang struct. So let's go ahead and create an empty struct first. That is the dimension in Golang. So we'll create an empty statistics API response. This is the outermost struct that we want. And then, like I said, we're going to use the JSON library encoding.json, which has the function onMarshal. So onMarshal, as it says, onMarshal parses the JSON encoded data and stores the results. So we're going to pass it the JSON encoded data, which is just in the body, right? Like so. And then we're going to pass it a reference to the stats object that we just created. Perfect. So now we can check if that actually succeeded. If it didn't succeed, again, we're in trouble. So we'll print out failed to onMarshal JSON body from response. So the response, for whatever reason, was wrong. And then we'll also log back the error. And let's exit out again and say that's no good. But if it did succeed, we can actually try printing out our stats object. Okay, so let's try compiling this and see how we get on. So it compiled, and let's run it. And there we go. So we're still printing out always other things. But what's interesting is the part down here. So this looks a bit different, right? So this is actually printing out our struct, and you can see that our struct has the same about the data from what there, but in a different format. And the reason that's interesting is now we have a proper Golang struct. So let's get rid of all the things we've printed so far to clean up our output a little bit. And then let's create some proper output, formatted in a nice way. So for that, again, we can, just like we did for the URL earlier, we can use something like for def, for the channel statistics, and then we'll do a new line, and we'll say the new count, for example, and the subscriber count, and let's put the videos as well, like so. And then we can add a new one like so. And then, actually, before we do that, let's just grab our channel stats, because we know that we successfully onMarshal things now. So we can grab the stats. Let's see. We can grab the stats dot items, and we can grab the first element, which will be our channel, and then we can grab the statistics out. So then we have our channel statistics, right? This will make our life easier, because now what we can do is, let me just put this on a new line. Hold on. So now what we can do is we can pass in the different things. We can start by passing in channel handle, right, for the first, and then we can pass in the U count, about the channel stats, And again, because we've created a my struct, we actually get some nice code completion here. So channel stats, dot video count, and that's pretty. Oh, we want to get in there. Let's just format this a little bit, and then the only thing we can do is we don't want to get an out of bounds exception there, so we can say if stats, if the length of stats dot items is smaller than 1, then we're actually, so basically it's 0, right? We didn't find any items. Then we're going to log an error again. So the channel was not found or contains the statistics. And then os.lex. This is unlikely to happen because our API call would have given us an error, I think, if the channel didn't exist. But just to be safe, we could do that. So now let's go ahead and build, and then we'll run it again. And here we go. So now we have some nice output that we can run again and again, right? And this is just, since it's just an executable that we created, we can actually just run it in our terminal, right? So if we clear this, and we just run with our run counter, right? And it would say nothing there, but we can also run it with our channel handle, which is del.io, and our API key, and I'll grab that one more time. Whoops. And there we go. Now we can run this as often as you want, our schedule, and we can use it to build some cool things. So that's the tutorial for today. So thank you for watching.